Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on the Seven Kings of Rome. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to look at the Roman monarchy. Before the Republic, before the Empire, there were 7 legendary kings of the city of Rome. So we're going to start by kind of seeing how we got there, then we'll tell the story of each one of these kings, and eventually kind of wrap that up with some concluding thoughts on a period of Roman history that few people know about. So how did we get here? Well, we started in the early Iron Age, right? Before Rome was ever even a city. We saw things like the Villanovan culture with these kind of burial urns, and eventually moved into the tribes of Italy, the most powerful of which were the Etruscans. From there, we're going to move today into the Roman monarchy. Romulus is the first of 7 kings of Rome, and we'll see how that kingship evolves through each of these leaders. Now, Romulus founded the city of Rome in 753 BC, and we saw that that was part of a struggle with his brother, right? After overthrowing their evil great uncle and restoring their grandfather to the throne of Alba Longa, they quarrel over where to found the city. And eventually Remus jumps over Romulus's walls, Romulus strikes him dead, and that's why we get the city of Rome, and not Rheims, founded on the Palatine Hill near the bend in the Tiber River. Now, when we're thinking about this, right, both the story of Romulus, but also the 7 kings of Rome, one of the things that we have to think about is kind of when this is supposed to be occurring historically and when our sources date to. So historically, the founding of Rome, April 21st, 753 BC. But our best sources for this are over 700 years later. So something like Virgil's Aeneid, right, which tells the story of Aeneas landing on the shores of Italy, that dates all the way to the 1st century BC. And then Livy, who actually gives us much of the mythology of Romulus and Remus, that's even later, the early 1st century CE. So when we think about this, both with Romulus and the other kings, right, what we're getting is kind of a mytho-history. There may be some actual historical elements, but this is kind of largely what later Romans believed, not necessarily exactly what actually happened. So let's take a look at the 7 kings of Rome. Now, one of the things you want to look at here as we look at our list of kings is let's take a look at the time period we're dealing with. So Romulus, the first king of Rome, starts in 753 BC. And Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, he ends his reign in 509 BC. And so we're talking 244 years of kingship for 7 kings. That's something like 42, 43, 44 years of reigning per king in Rome. Strike that. That's like 30-something. Either way, right? These are ridiculously long reigns, okay? And it's totally possible for any single king to reign for 30 or 40 years. It's completely impossible to have a string of 7 kings that each rule for 30 or 40 years. It's never been done in the history of any civilization. No series of kings lasts that long. And so this is part of what tells us that what we're looking at kind of is a mythical history, probably with many other leaders interspersed. But something that kind of tells us about what each of these kings means to the city. All right? So kind of think of it like that. There probably weren't just 7 kings of Rome. And then on the other hand, each of these 7 kings, what Romans thought of them, right? They contribute something to who the Roman people actually are and what the city of Rome is. And so even though there weren't really 7 kings, in the Romans' eyes, there kind of were 7 kings. So let's start with Romulus, right? Romulus is known as the prototypical warrior. He's the one who's kind of able to lead the charge against his evil uncle. They found the city, and the first thing he does is start trying to take over his neighbors. And those neighbors in particular, he starts by trying to take over the Sabines. And this is really important for the city of Rome because they don't have women at the beginning, right? Rome is founded as a series of outcast men. They need women to propagate the city. And so they invite their Sabine neighbors over in the middle of the party, right? They give the signal, they kick the men out, they take the women. And the Sabines then become the founding kind of women of Rome. And eventually, once the Romans and Sabines fight, it's the women who jump into the middle of the battle and say, guys, cut it out, all right? We're staying with the Romans. You guys are our husbands now. you guys are our brothers and fathers. If you want to kill anybody, kill us. And thus, kind of Rome now has a population that can propagate itself. And then at the end of the life of Romulus, right, after continuing warfare with other tribes right around the city of Rome, the story is that he's basically taken up into the heavens. Okay, so that's the story of Romulus. Let's go ahead and take a look at the second king. One of the best names in all of Roman history, a king by the name of Numa Pompilius, reigning from 715 to 674 BCE. So, Numa Pompilius is kind of known as the pious king, the religious king. And so when you think about this, right, you can think of Romulus as the warrior and Numa as kind of the religious guy. And what's going on here is that Livy, the guy writing the history of these kings, is basically trying to tell his readers what makes a good Roman and what makes a good Roman leader. A good Roman leader is somebody who has the courage and bravery and skill in warfare of Romulus, and who has the religious piety of the king Numa. And so again, whether or not he was an actual person, he's representing kind of half of what it means to be a really good person and a really good leader in Roman society. So he does a number of religious things. So he brings the Vestal Virgins from Alba Longa to Rome. He starts the Temple of Janus in the city of Rome. That's what we're looking at here. And the Temple of Janus is in the Roman Forum, and it's kind of highly symbolic with its doors. When the temple doors are closed, Rome is at peace. And so after he builds this, he closes the doors, Rome is at peace. And only two other times over the next 700 years, are the doors ever closed. That's how much Rome is at war kind of after the time of Numa. They're constantly at war except for two other times. He also brings the 360-day calendar to Rome. He adds the months of January and February. And he starts a series of priestly colleges as well. So again, Romulus is the militaristic king. Numa is the religious king. Now, one of the other things with kind of Numa, just to touch on him one more time, he's also a Sabine. So after the big conflict between the Romans and the Sabines, what they decide is that they're going to alternate leadership. So Romulus is a Roman, Numa is a Sabine, and then we're going to alternate as we go until we get a whole new group entering the scene. Now our next guy we're talking about is Tullus Hostilius, who reigns from 673 to 642 BCE. And take a guess at what his nature is like, right? Just think about the name. That's right, Tullus Hostilius, the hostile king. So Tullus Hostilius goes ahead and he abandons Numa's kind of sense of peacefulness, and he starts fighting with his neighbors once again. In particular, he starts fighting with the Alba Longans. And this is kind of weird, right? Remember, Romulus's grandfather was the king of Alba Longa. Alba Longa is basically the little town next door that's closest to Rome, right? They have great connections. And him starting a fight with the Alba Longans is almost a kind of a civil war. One of the things that we'll see later is the result of this, as Rome wins that battle, is that he brings the population of Alba Longa, settles them in the city of Rome. Rome grows to such a size that they need a new Senate house, right? And so he's the first one to build the kind of enlarged Senate house that we know as the Curia Hostilia. Now when he's fighting the Alba Longans, they start to decide that maybe it's not a very good use of people to have these giant wars with each of the neighboring towns. And even though he does want to take over the town, maybe there's a simpler way. And what Tullus Hostilius comes up with is a kind of form of battle where he's going to take 3 of Rome's best warriors and pit them against 3 of the Alba Longans' best warriors, and the winner takes all. So the Romans have 3 brothers, the Horatii, and the Alba Longans have 3 brothers, the Curatii, and they start to battle. And in this battle, the Alba Longans take the lead almost immediately. So the 3 Curatii are able to kill 2 of the Horatii almost immediately. So now it's 1 Roman against 3 of the Alba Longans. And this is where the Roman gets a little bit smart. So what he does, maybe not the bravest thing, he basically turns around and he just starts running. and he's running, and he's running, and he's running, and the Curati are chasing him the whole way. And eventually, right, the Curati, they kind of run at different speeds, and they kind of get a little bit spread out. And when they get spread out, the last of the Hostilius brothers turns around and is able to kill that first of the Curatius brothers. And then he turns around and he starts running again, right? And he's running and he's running and running. And the two other leftover Curati, they get spread out. And this time the last of the Hostilius brothers turns around and kills that guy. And now it's one-on-one with the final battle, right? Between the last of the Hostilius brothers, the last of the Curatius brothers, and the Roman is able to defeat the Alba Longan. That's securing victory for Rome and securing victory for Tullus Hostilius, and that whole population of Alba Longa comes over to Rome. Next up, we got another kind of relatively peaceful guy, a guy by the name of Ancus Marcius, who's actually the grandson probably of Numa Pompilius, once again a Sabine leader. Now, Ancus Marcius is known for starting a couple of different very large projects. The first of those projects is the site of Ostia. And Ostia is super important because this is the port of the city of Rome. So this is basically on the Tyrrhenian Sea. This is in the kind of basically on the Mediterranean. Rome is like 15 miles away, right? Rome is up the river and can't be reached by the large warships that would be floating around the Mediterranean. That's one of the reasons it's protected. So they need a port, though, so they can engage in trade with the rest of the kind of Mediterranean world, so that they could build a fleet to attack the rest of the Mediterranean world. And it's Ancus Marcius who starts that city. Now, one of the cool things here is that we actually have a lot of the remains of this port city. So the kind of coast has shifted over time, right? It used to would have come to like right around there. But all of this stuff right here, these are all archaeological remains from the city of Ostia. So it's incredibly well preserved, and outside the cities of Vesuvius, Pompeii, and Herculaneum, this is one of the best preserved sites in all of Italy. And one of the things that we really know it for is it's so well preserved and excavated that we have a lot of remains of actual kind of like regular people's houses. And in particular at this site, they were big into apartment buildings. This is actually kind of like a granary thing here, but we have a lot of apartment buildings from the city of Ostia and get a good sense for kind of what daily life is like for people in the Roman world. Now, after Ancus Marcius, we get Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, which translates as Tarquin the Elder. Now, the name changes a little bit here, and we've been going Roman, Sabine, and now we get a new cultural group. We see that Lucius Tarquinius Priscus is not Roman, and he's not Sabine, he's actually Etruscan. So remember that group, that tribe of Italians, north of Rome, south of the Alps, that ends up being kind of so powerful in the early days. Well, early on, this whole cultural group is way more powerful than Rome itself. You can see the kind of territory of the Etrurians, right, the Etruscans, and Rome at this time is just this piddly little, very dark red area. And so Tarquin the Elder is able to take over, and he's able to do so in a clever kind of way. So what he does is when Ancus Marcius dies, Ancus Marcius's two sons are kind of probably next in line. The throne's not hereditary. We haven't seen father and son kind of take over, but they would have a good claim on the throne. But what he does, Tarquin the Elder sends these guys out hunting. And basically, while they're out hunting, right, and their dad dies, they're out there for kind of quite a while. And he's basically able to consolidate power in Rome, turn everybody to his side so that by the time Ancus Marcius's sons get back, he's already the new king. And kind of in terms of the mythology, he's seen as kind of very blessed. So on his way into the city of Rome, basically a bird comes in, right? An eagle comes in and snatches the hat off of his head, right, with its talons. But then before he gets to the city, the same eagle comes back down and puts the hat right back on his head. And so this is kind of a mythical analogy that he is kind of rightfully crowned the king of Rome. Now, even though he's an Etruscan guy, Tarquin the Elder is responsible for a number of major developments in early Rome. This is kind of a gross one. It's called the Cloaca Maximus, basically the great drain or the great sewer, right? It's kind of a weird thing to be known for building a giant sewer. But this is actually incredibly important in the early city. Remember, we have all these high hills, and on top of the hills it's really dry, and they're easily defensible. But between all these hills, it's really kind of wet and swampy, right? All the water from the river kind of spills over into these little areas, and it gets real swampy. You can't build anything there. And so, Tarquin the Elder is able to basically drain these areas. He builds this kind of great drain below ground. He's able to take out the water, and all of a sudden these areas in between the hills are usable. And this is where we get the origins of the Roman Forum. The Forum is the area down low between the hills, between the Capitoline and the Palatine and the Esquiline, that then becomes the center of kind of Roman commercial and public space. Tarquin the Elder also is the first to establish the Circus Maximus. So a circus is where they do chariot racing. A stadium is where they do running. A circus is where you do chariot racing. And so it would not have looked anything kind of like this in antiquity. This is much, much later in the Roman Empire, right? In its earliest days, right, it would have just been kind of an open track, maybe with some banked hillsides. But he's the first one to start that. Now, as we move on from Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, we get to Servius Tullius, the sixth of the kings in Rome. And he rules from 578 to 535 BC. Now, he also kind of contributes a number of key things to the city itself. So it's under Servius Tullius that we get the first coinage in the city of Rome. And just look at the size of this thing, right? This is known as an ice grave. So basically a heavy bronze. And it's basically just about the size of the palm of your hand and would weigh like a pound or more. So not the most efficient way of coinage, but we get that earliest coinage, and that really facilitates economic transactions between different groups. All of a sudden, you don't have to trade sheep for grain. You can trade grain for money, and you can trade sheep for money, and you can trade armor for money, and then you can buy anything you want with it. Servius Tullius is also the first guy to build a stone wall around the city. Before, it was just kind of a wooden fence. And this is known as the Servian Wall, and we still have remnants of it today. Now, this is kind of weird. We call it the Servian Wall. This thing was actually probably built about 200 years after him, somewhere in the kind of 4th century BC. But nevertheless, we call it the Servian Wall. And what you're looking at here are these large blocks of tufa running right into this big building. And this big building is actually the main train station in modern Rome, Roma Termini. And one of the really wild kind of things is that if you go in, right, you can see it running right in there. And if you go into the train station and you go downstairs, you can go see the wall continue. And the wall actually splits right through a McDonald's. And so you can sit down and you can have your Big Mac, and you're eating like with these tables that are basically like drilled in to the Servian Wall, right, over 2,000 years old. Kind of a super weird kind of, I don't know, way to preserve ancient material culture. He's also the guy that does the most work on the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. Now, Jupiter Capitolinus is basically the biggest temple in the ancient city of Rome. So throughout most of antiquity, there are many, many temples in Rome. This is the biggest and the best and the baddest. It's awesome. And so he's the one who kind of does the most work on that, and that's the centerpiece of the Capitoline Hill. Now finally we get to the last of the 7 kings, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. So he's probably somehow related to the other one, maybe the grandson of the other Tarquin. But Tarquinius Superbus, this translates as Tarquin the Proud. Now Lucius Tarquinius Superbus comes to the throne through kind of unsavory, violent ways. And even though he's kind of not kind of the rightful heir to the throne here, he starts to rule in a way that kind of mimics how he got to the throne. And so he makes himself kind of the supreme judge. He's putting people to death without trials. He's ruling with an iron fist. And this very much goes with kind of the saying that absolute power, right? If you have a king, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And even though those first series of kings, right, Romulus and Numa, were really good dudes, by the time we get to Tarquin the Proud, the kingship of Rome is totally corrupt. And we see this best exemplified in what's known as the rape of Lucretia. So Tarquin the Proud's son, Sextus Tarquinius, ends up thinking that he can do whatever he wants. And it gets so bad, it gets to the point where he's taking senators' wives, kind of the nobles of the city of Rome. He's taking their wives and having his way with them. And at one point in time, he takes the wife of a guy named Collatinus. Her name is Lucretia. He basically takes her, has his way with her. And she is so dishonored by this that she ends up killing herself. And in ancient Rome, this was seen as like kind of the honorable thing, right? She had been dishonored. She was going to regain that honor by killing herself. And it's this moment that kind of sets off the nobles of the city of Rome to the point where they will no longer take this kind of tyrannical rule of a king. And this is the event that sparks the overthrow of that kingship and ushers in what will become the Roman Republic. So, a couple concluding thoughts. On the one hand, we want to start by talking about how Rome is small, right? Greece expands incredibly fast. Remember, Athens starts that 8th century Renaissance, and by 500 BC, it's got democracy, it's got philosophy, it's got all these amazing things. Rome, on the other hand, still just has this piddly little area right there, very, very small. And much of what we have in terms of our early stories of the Roman kings is mythological. Virgil and Livy, they're writing 750 years after the founding of the city, and they're kind of projecting back onto those early rulers. And nevertheless, right, even though there might not have just been 7 kings, they're kind of exemplified as each contributing key parts to Roman identity: Romulus, the military leader; Numa, the religious leader; or key parts to the city of Rome: the Senate House, the city walls, the Circus, or the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. And in the end, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we see the son of the king having his way with a nobleman's wife, she killing herself, and eventually sparking the revolt against the kings, the installation of the Roman Republic, and the ideology of that republic that remains for 500 years. Never again will we have a single person rule the Roman people. And we'll see how that doesn't actually necessarily be the case for all of Roman history. But for the next 500 years, that's the ideology that governs them. And so that's kind of the story, the mytho-history of the 7 kings of Rome.